Hey y'all, welcome back guys, and today we're looking at GDP for KIP economics. Introduction to macroeconomics. Throughout our studies of microeconomics, we learned several key concepts, most for which there is a similar concept which we will study in macroeconomics. The table below shows several of the micro concepts we studied and their macro equivalents. Micro concepts are market, demand, supply, price, quantity, decrease in demand, increase in demand, decrease in supply, and increase in supply. The macro concept equivalents are national economy, aggregate demand AD, aggregate supply AS, average price level, national outputs or income, recession, inflation, supply shock, and economic growth. Key terms in macroeconomics. For national economy, it examines all the economic activity taking place in a country. Aggregate supply, this is the total demand for a nation's output of goods and services. Aggregate supply, the total supply of goods and services by all the industries of a country. Average price level, it's an index of the average prices of goods and services over time. National output or income is the total output of all the industries of a country. Recession is a fall in total output resulting from a decrease in AD. Inflation is an increase in the average price level resulting from an increase in AD. Supply shock, an increase in the price level and decrease in output from a fall in AS. Economic growth is an increase in national output resulting from an increase in AS. Then I have to look at a circular flow diagram. And this right here is a two-sector circular flow diagram that is closed. We should know that the red arrow symbolizes physical flow and the green arrow symbolizes money flow. We have two economic agents operating in this circular flow, guys. We have the firms and then we have the households. The firms produce and sell goods and services and hire the factors of production. And they get that from the factor input that they employ from the resource market. Because in the resource market, we assume that the households will sell they own the factors of production and sell those factors of production to the firms, and in return, the firms buy all. Then the firm produces goods and services and sell these outputs in the product market, where the household buy all of goods and the firm sells. And in return, the household collect the goods and services they actually need, so they consume all the goods and services from the firm, and then from that, the whole cycle continues, where the household employs, produce goods. The firm employs, produces goods, and the household buys. And from the product market, we see that the firm receive revenue, and that revenue it will be part of the firm's cost of production, because remember they have to reward the factors of production for their employment, for example, wages to labor. And then afterwards, when the household receive these, they will spend it on consumer goods. So guys, this is a circular flow diagram highlighting a two-sector where we assume only two economic agents operate within, that is the firms and the households. The macroeconomic circular flow. In the Introduction to Economics unit of the course, you learned about the circular flow of income in a market economy. In macroeconomics, we have added several features to this model, including a government sector. The government collects taxes from households and firms. These are a leakage from the circular flow and contribute government expenditures on public goods or government spending, as it is known. These are injections into the circular flow. A foreign sector, a nation spends money on foreign goods, that is imports. This is a leakage, and earns money by selling goods to foreigners, which is an export, and it's known as an injection into the circular flow. Then we have the banking sector. Households and firms save money in the banking sector, a leakage, and the banks provide households and firms with funds for investment, which is an injection. And this right here, guys, is a modified version of a two-sector circular flow, highlighting more elements that were added, of course. And in this one, injections and leakages are present. Injections and leakages. Injections. Government spending, export revenues, and investments are all considered injections to the circular flow of income. Leakages. Taxes paid to the government, spending on imports from foreign or abroad, and money saved in the banks are all considered leakages from the circular flow of income. So anytime the government gets involved, as well as the banking sector or the foreign sector, there will be injections and leakages present. Three approaches to measuring outputs. Moving on. Looking closely at the circular flow model, we can see that there is a relationship between the amount of income earned, the expenditures made, and the total output. The economic activity of a nation can, in fact, be measured using any of these three methods. The income approach measures GDP by recording the income of household in the resource market side of the circular flow of income. Income includes payments household received in the resource market in exchange for providing firms with the factors of production, including the total sum of each of the following earned by a nation's households in a year. That is wages for labor, interest for capital, rent for land, and profits for entrepreneurship. The national income will be equal to W plus I plus R plus P. The output approach measures the value of the total output produced in the different sectors of the economy. When the total output of each or every sector of the nation's economy is summed, total output is found. National output is equal to outputs of the primary sector plus the secondary sector, and so on and so forth, plus the tertiary sector onwards. The expenditure approach counts the total spending on final new goods and services in a given year. Final goods are ready for consumption, that is, and do not include goods that will be input goods or raw materials for other production. This approach distinguishes between four types of spending on a nation's output. These include households consumption, C, denoted by the symbol C or letter C, investment in capital by firms, denoted by I, government spending, denoted by G, and net export, denoted by capital X, N. And total expenditure is equal to C plus I plus G plus XN. GDP. What is GDP? The market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given time period. GDP has to measure different products. GDP is the market value. Yes, it has to measure different products. For example, apples and oranges. It can only do that by calculating everything on the basis of its market value of all. GDP tries to be as comprehensive as possible, but cannot measure everything. Examples: domestic services, underground economy, etc. Final. GDP tries to avoid double counting, so it excludes intermediate goods that are used to produce final goods. For example, wheat for bread. Exception is unsold inventory at the end of the year. Goods and services. GDP includes both physical goods as well as services, even government services such as police and firefighters produced. GDP only includes things produced in the current period. It excludes things that were produced earlier and resold. For example, used cars, stock trading. It's in a country. GDP looks at where goods are physically produced or services performed. So if a US citizen works in China, his or her production is counted as China's GDP in a given time period. GDP is usually measured annually or quarterly. It's a flow measure versus a stock measure. If measured quarterly, the number is usually annualized, and seasonally adjusted. What is included in GDP? GDP measures the value of the final output of goods and services in a nation in a given year. But there are some economic transactions which are not included in GDP. GDP includes all only the final goods, products, and services. GDP is the value of which has been produced within the borders of a nation over 1 year, not what was actually sold. GDP excludes non-production transactions. For example, purely financial transactions are excluded. Public transfer payments like Social Security or cash welfare benefits. Private transfer payments like student allowances or alimony payments. A sale of stocks and bonds represent a transfer of existing assets. However, the broker's fees are included for services rendered. Second-hand sales. If I buy a used car in 2008, that sale does not count towards 2008's GDP because the car was not made in 2008. Price of the car was originally included in the year's GDP when it was produced. The components of GDP. The expenditure approach to measuring GDP measures total spending on a nation's output by households, firms, the government, and foreigners. The four types of spending are outlined. Household consumption, denoted by C. The purchase by households of all goods and services include non-durables, for example, bread, milk, toothpaste, t-shirts, socks, toys, etc. Durables like TVs, computers, cars, refrigerators, etc. Then we have services, dentist visits, haircuts, taxi rides, accountants, lawyers, doctors, and so forth. Gross private domestic investment, all final purchases of machinery, equipment, and tools by businesses, all construction including residential. Changes in business inventories. If total output exceeds current sales, inventories build up. If businesses are able to sell more than they currently produce, this entry will be a negative number. Government purchases of consumption goods and capital goods includes spending by all levels of government, that is, federal, state, or local. Includes all direct purchases of resources, that is, labor in particular. This entry excludes transfer payments since these outlays do not reflect current production. Then we have net exports. All spending on goods produced in the US must be included in GDP, whether the purchase is made here or abroad. Often, goods produced and measured in the US are produced elsewhere, which are inputs. Therefore, net exports is a difference between exports minus inputs and can be either a positive or negative number depending on which is the larger amount. Then we have components of GDP Y, consumer spending, spending by households on goods and services, but exclude, for example, the purchase of new housing. Investment or business spending, spending on capital equipment, inventory and building, for example, includes household purchases of new housing. Government purchases, G, Spending on goods and services by all levels of government includes wages of government workers, but excludes transfer payments. On net exports, spending on domestic goods by foreigners, minus spending on foreign, minus spending on goods by domestic residents, yeah. Therefore, y is equal to c plus I plus g plus x minus m. Then we're going to look at nominal GDP and real GDP. Nominal GDP measures the value of a nation's output produced in a year expressed in the value of the prices charged for that year. But if the average price level of a nation's output increases in a year, nominal GDP could increase even if the actual amount of output does not change, since everything will appear more expensive at higher prices. To determine the change in the real GDP, the actual output of a nation adjusted for changes in the price level, economists must measure the value of a nation's output in 1 year using the price level from a base year. In the case of the price level increasing, which is inflation, real GDP will be lower than the nominal GDP. In the case of the price level decreasing, deflation, as it is known, real GDP will be higher than the nominal GDP. Real GDP. What is real GDP? Real GDP is the value of a nation's output in a particular year, adjusted for changes in the price level from a base year. Offers a more accurate measure of actual quantity of goods and services a nations produce because it adjusts for price changes. Nominal GDP and real GDP. To adjust a nation's nominal GDP in 1 year to its real GDP, we must measure the value of output using prices from a base year. Consider the country scene here. If we want to know the 2010 real GDP with 2009 as a base year, we must find the value of 2010's output in 2009 prices. So that would be 12 units of cheese at $2, which is equal to or has a monetary value of $24. 25 units of chocolate at $2 will have a monetary value of $50. And 5 units of watches at $10 will have a monetary value of $50, causing us to have 2010 real GDP being equal to 124. The GDP deflator is equal to nominal GDP divided by real GDP. For this country, the GDP deflator is equal to 160 divided by 124, which is equal to 1.29. With this, we know that prices rose by 29% between 2009 and 2010. Calculating real GDP using a GDP deflator. The GDP deflator is a price index that can be used to adjust a nation's nominal GDP for changes in the price level. The GDP deflator is an indicator of how much prices have changed between 2 years. For a base year, the deflator always equals 100, since the real GDP will be equal to the nominal GDP. If in a later year the index is 110, this means that prices have risen by 10% between those years. If it is 120, prices have risen by 20%. If it is 95, then prices have fell by 5% and so on. Consider the table below, showing nominal and real GDP data for the United States. And we should note that for each of the years from 2007 on, real GDP was lower than nominal because the deflator increased each year, indicating that there was inflation. Therefore, nominal GDP would have overstated the changes in the real output from year to year. Real GDP and real GDP per capita. A nation's real GDP tells us the actual value of its output in a particular year, adjusted for any changes in the price level between that year and an earlier base year. However, real GDP does not tell us whether a nation is rich or poor. Consider the pie graph below. Real GDP is a better indicator of output than nominal GDP. Countries' share of world GDP based on purchasing power parity for the year 2011. And we see that the United States, China, Japan, India, and countries like Germany has a greater share of world GDP based on purchasing power parity, that is. And this diagram is taken from the International Monetary Fund, guys, for for the year 2012. Yes. Rise and fall, GDP at purchasing power parity ranking. You see that this ranking is not constant, and countries always increase their purchasing power parity, sometimes decrease it. For, well, I wouldn't say that purchasing power parity has decreased. It's just that other countries have been on a trajectory of increasing their purchasing power parity, giving them a higher ranking. And we look at projected average annual real growth in GDP 2009 to 2050, and we see that most of the developing world will have real GDP growth higher than most developed countries because of course they have more room to grow. Yeah. Per capita GDP. Per capita GDP measures the total GDP of a nation divided by the total population. GDP per capita is a better indicator of the well-being of a typical person in a nation than total GDP. For example, the countries listed below, know that only one of the richest nations in the table are even in the top 10 for total GDP. Why is GDP important? GDP is considered by economists to be the most important measure of economic activity in nations for several reasons. It tells us something about the relative size of different countries' economy. It is a monetary measure, so it tells us how much income a country earns in a year. A similar thing that is produced is sold. When we divide GDP by the population, we get GDP per capita, which tells us how many goods and services the average person consumes in a country. When real GDP grows more than the population, that tells us that people on average have more stuff than they did before. And if you believe that having more stuff makes people better off, then GDP per capita tells us how well off people in society are. And as a whole, if people have an enlargement of choice, we should keep in mind that this is related to or referring to economic development. And we cannot have economic development unless there is economic growth. Just to keep in mind. Limitations of GDP. Data inaccuracies, unrecorded activities, for example, informal transactions, for example, voluntary work, parenting, etc. DIY work or do-it-yourself work, for example, subsistence farming, home repair, etc. Then we have the underground economies. Then we have external costs or benefits, resource depletion, pollution or pollution cleanup, and then we have the composition of outputs, that is bad. Semi-automatic rifle versus HR baby food. Does not reflect improved product quality. As quality of products improve, they may be sold at equal or lower price. Nor does it measure how GDP is distributed in among the population. Indicators such as Gini coefficient are not considered. Equity is not a priority. And then we have the quality of life, luxury time, or leisure time. safety, quiet, stress, aesthetic aspects of life. These are all not included, guys, in the calculation of GDP. And then we have this diagram right here, showing the richest 1% versus everyone else, average income for the year 2002 to 2007. And we're seeing that the richest 1% have increased their earning potential exponentially than the other, well, than everyone else, that is. Yeah. Then we have alternative measures to GDP. So while gross domestic product is a primary measure of a nation's output, in a particular year, economists have developed alternative measures of output, which are sometimes referred to instead of GDP. These include gross national product, measures the total value of output produced in a year by the factors of production provided by a country. Differs from GDP in that it includes output produced abroad by domestically owned factories, but subtracts output produced domestically by foreign-owned factories. Does not offer an accurate measure of the actual economic activity within a nation as GDP does, and is therefore not considered as useful as GDP for measuring output of a nation. Then we have green GDP. This is an underused measure of economic activity which subtracts from real GDP the losses to the environment and biodiversity resulting from economic growth. Places a monetary value on environmental degradation and subtracts this from a nation's GDP. It's a measure preferred by environmentalists who believe that economic growth overstates increases in people's well-being due to the fact that it ignores the externalities that accompany growth. And that is it, guys. See you all next time.